In the history of warfare, there are battles won by strength, battles won by luck, and then there are battles won by ghosts. In the summer of 1457, the Ottoman Empire marched into the mountains of Albania with a force that should have been unstoppable. 40,000 men, led by the empire's finest generals and guided by a traitor who knew every secret of the resistance. Their target was Skanderbeg, the legendary rebel commander who had defied the Sultan for 14 years, but when the Ottoman army arrived, they found nothing. The villages were empty, the forts were abandoned, the passes were unguarded. For months, the most powerful army in the world chased shadows. They heard rumors that Skanderbeg had fled to Italy, that his army had dissolved, that the rebellion was dead. Convinced of their victory, the Ottomans set up camp in the lush valley of Albulena to celebrate. They unpacked their supplies, they relaxed their guard, and they slept soundly, believing they were the masters of the land. They were wrong. Skanderbeg hadn't fled. He hadn't quit. He was watching them. For months, he had been hiding his entire army of 8,000 men in the dense forest just a few miles away, living in absolute silence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He had turned his soldiers into ghosts, invisible to the enemy until it was too late. On a hot September afternoon, while the Ottoman soldiers rested in the midday sun, the ghosts materialized. What followed was not a battle, it was an annihilation. In the span of a few hours, a force of 8,000 men destroyed an army of 40,000. It was a massacre so complete that it humiliated an empire and cemented Skanderbeg's legacy as the master of the ambush. This is the story of how the dead came back to life. This is the story of Albulena. The year 1457 opened with a silence that was more terrifying than the sound of cannons. For the courts of Europe, from the Vatican in Rome to the merchant halls of Venice, this silence was the sound of a holding breath. For over a decade, saw the Albanian warlord George Castrioti, known to the world by his Ottoman title Skanderbeg, had been the singular anomaly of the age. In a time when the Ottoman Empire was swallowing kingdoms whole, crushing Serbia, Bulgaria, and Byzantium under the wheels of its war machine, Skanderbeg had done the impossible. He had held the line, with no treasury, no major allies, and a ragtag army of mountain men. He had humiliated the Sultan's armies time and time again. He was the athlete of Christ, the shield of the West. But legends, no matter how bright they burn, are fragile things. And in the brutal game of empires, even the strongest shield can be shattered by a single, intimate act of treachery. That treachery did not come from a stranger. It did not come from a rival warlord or a paid assassin. It came from the man who stood closest to the fire. Hamza Castrioti was Skanderbeg's own flesh and blood, his nephew, his confidant, and his finest battlefield commander. Hamza was a warrior of frightening talent. He possessed the same tactical brilliance as his uncle, the same charisma, and the same intimate knowledge of the Albanian terrain. For years they had been inseparable, two lions guarding the same pride. They had slept on the same cold rocks, eaten the same stale bread, and ridden into the same storms of arrows. To the Albanian soldiers, Hamza was the heir apparent, the future of the resistance. But Hamza was also a man eaten alive by a slow, cancerous ambition. He looked at his uncle, aging, stubborn, refusing to bend the knee, and he saw a man fighting a war that could not be won. Hamza looked at the map of the world and saw the Ottoman Empire spreading like ink across water. He saw their limitless gold, their endless reserves of manpower, and their inevitability. He began to ask himself a dangerous question. Why die for a lost cause when I could rule as a king? He wanted power. He wanted the security of a title that wouldn't be taken away by the next invasion. He wanted to be on the winning side of history. And so, in the spring of 1457, Hamza made his choice. He vanished from the Albanian camp and rode hard for the border. When he arrived in Constantinople, the gates were thrown open for him. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, the man who had ended the Roman Empire, welcomed Hamza not as a prisoner but as a savior. The Sultan saw Hamza for exactly what he was, the key to finally unlocking the Albanian puzzle. For years, the Ottomans had smashed their armies against the Albanian mountains, only to be bled dry by Skanderbeg's guerrilla tactics. They were fighting a ghost they couldn't catch. But now they had the ghost keeper. Hamza sat down with the Ottoman High Command in the war rooms of the Topkapi Palace, and he poured out everything. He didn't just give them maps, he gave them the psychology of the enemy. He explained exactly how Skanderbeg thought. He told them, "My uncle is not a magician. He is a gambler. He relies on your impatience. He baits you into the narrow passes where your numbers don't count. He attacks your supply lines because he knows he can't beat you in the open field." Hamza handed the Ottomans the blueprint to destroy the rebellion. He told them that the Albanian army was fragile, exhausted, and held together only by the myth of Skanderbeg's invincibility. "Break the myth," Hamza said, "and the army will break itself." Armed with this lethal intelligence, the Sultan authorized an invasion force of staggering proportions. This was not a punitive expedition. It was an extermination event. 40,000 soldiers were mobilized from the provinces of Rumelia and Anatolia. The core of this army consisted of 15,000 elite janissaries, the Sultan's own household troops, men taken as children and raised to be the perfect killing machines. They were supported by 20,000 Akinji light cavalry, the terror of the Balkans, and a massive train of artillery and supplies. The command of this juggernaut was given to Ishak Bey Evrenos, a seasoned general who had spent his life fighting on the frontier. Ishak Bey was a cautious, methodical commander, the perfect counterbalance to Hamza's aggressive ambition. But make no mistake, Hamza was the real weapon. The Sultan appointed him as the governor of the Albanian lands before they were even conquered. It was a promise and a threat. Hamza rode at the head of the army, not just as an advisor, but as a king coming to claim his crown. When this massive force crossed the border, the mood in Albania shifted from defiance to apocalypse. The people knew that this time was different. The enemy wasn't walking blindly into a trap. They had a guide. They knew where the hidden granaries were buried. They knew the secret paths through the forests. They knew where the villagers hid their children during the raids. The panic was immediate and total. Refugees flooded the mountain roads, clutching their few possessions, heading desperately for the coast, hoping to find Venetian ships that would take them to Italy. The fortresses barred their gates, preparing for long, hopeless sieges that would end in starvation. Skanderbeg's response to this existential threat was baffling to everyone around him. For 14 years, his strategy had been aggressive defense. He would meet the enemy at the border, harass them, bleed them, and never let them rest. But this time, he did nothing. He did not mobilize the peasant militias. He did not send his light cavalry to sting the Ottoman columns. He allowed Ishak Bey and Hamza to march unopposed through the Drin Valley. He allowed them to burn villages and loot towns. To the outside world, it looked like the betrayal had finally broken him. It looked like the lion of Albania had lost his teeth. But Skanderbeg was not broken. He was evolving. He realized instantly that with Hamza on the other side, his old playbook was worse than useless. It was a suicide note. He couldn't use his standard ambushes because Hamza knew where they would be. He couldn't use his standard signals because Hamza knew the codes. He realized that to defeat an enemy who knew his presence, he had to convince them of his absence. He had to make Hamza believe that his betrayal had actually worked. So, Skanderbeg executed a maneuver that required more discipline than any charge. He took his 8,000 men, a mixture of hardened veterans who had fought with him since the beginning, and terrified peasant levies, and he led them away from the war. He marched them into the wildest, most desolate parts of the mountain ranges, into the peaks of Mount Tumanishta. These were places where the air was thin, where the snow never fully melted, and where even the goats struggled to walk. He imposed a discipline that was stricter than death. No fires, not even to cook food. No talking above a whisper. No movement during the daylight hours when the glint of sun on armor could give them away. He turned his army into a phantom. As the weeks passed, the Ottoman juggernaut marched deeper into the heart of Albania, finding only ghosts. They expected resistance at every turn. They expected arrows to fly from the tree line, but there was only silence. They captured forts, but found them empty of soldiers, with only old men and women left behind who claimed they hadn't seen Skanderbeg in months. Ishak Bey and Hamza began to believe their own luck. They started to think that the intelligence reports were true, that Skanderbeg really had fled to Italy, or that his army had mutinied and killed him. The tension in the Ottoman ranks began to ease. Soldiers stopped sleeping in their armor. The deep reconnaissance patrols became shorter and less frequent. After all, why scout for an enemy that doesn't exist? They were winning the war without firing a shot, or so they thought. By late August 1457, the Ottoman invasion force had reached its primary objective, the Mat River Valley, known locally as Albulena. To the eyes of Ishak Bey and Hamza Castrioti, this location seemed like a gift from God. The valley was a lush, sprawling expanse of green, fed by the cool waters of the river and protected on three sides by rolling hills. It was fertile ground, rich in unharvested grain and fresh water, solving the logistical nightmare of feeding 40,000 men and thousands of horses. But more than its resources, its location was symbolic. Albulena sat squarely in the heart of Skanderbeg's territory. It was the crossroads of the resistance. By planting the Sultan's flag here, they were driving a stake into the very heart of the rebellion. The Ottoman commanders felt a sense of invincibility that bordered on intoxication. It had been months since anyone had seen a significant Albanian force. The intelligence reports coming in from their network of spies that Skanderbeg had masterfully fed with false information, confirmed their wildest hopes. One report claimed that Skanderbeg had been seen in the port city of Durrës, begging the Venetian Senate for a ship to carry him into exile. Another claimed that his army had dissolved into banditry, starving and leaderless in the mountains. A third claimed he was already dead, struck down by a fever. These were lies carefully crafted by Skanderbeg's counterintelligence. But to Hamza, they rang true. They confirmed his own bias. He believed he had broken his uncle. He believed that the betrayal had shattered Skanderbeg's will to fight. Ishak Bey, usually a man of caution, allowed himself to be swept up in the confidence of his co-commander. He ordered the army to establish a semi-permanent camp in the valley. But this wasn't the tight defensive war camp of an army in hostile territory. It was a sprawling, relaxed city of canvas and silk. Tents stretched for miles across the plain, arranged not for defense, but for comfort. The soldiers, convinced that the war was effectively over, began to shed the hard discipline of the march. They bathed in the river. They organized wrestling matches. They traded loot and stories. The Janissaries, usually the most disciplined soldiers in the world, unbuckled their heavy armor and slept in their tunics. Hamza Castrioti began to act not like a general, but like the ruler he expected to become. He established a court in his lavish command tent. He received local chieftains who came down from the hills to surrender, accepting their tribute of goats and wine and promising them mercy in exchange for their loyalty to the new order. He drank toast to the Sultan's health and to his own future as the Prince of Albania. He looked out at the tranquil valley and saw peace. He did not see the trap. But while the Ottomans feasted in the valley, a very different scene was playing out just a few miles away. In the dark, suffocating canopy of the forest on Mount Tumenishta, Skanderbeg's army was living in a state of suspended animation. For weeks, 8,000 men had been hiding in the tree line. looking down at the smoke rising from the Ottoman campfires. The discipline required for this feat is almost unimaginable to the modern mind. Imagine keeping 8,000 hungry, angry men and thousands of war horses completely silent and invisible for that long. Skanderbeg was everywhere among them, a silent ghost moving through the trees. He enforced a regimen of absolute stealth. The soldiers ate cold rations of dried meat and hard bread to avoid lighting fires that would create smoke. They spoke in hand signals or whispers. The horses were kept in deep ravines, their hooves wrapped in thick cloth to muffle the sound of their steps, their muzzles tied to prevent them from whinnying. It was a torture of stillness. Every man in that forest knew that just a few miles away, the invaders were eating their food, drinking their wine, and occupying their land. The rage in the Albanian ranks was palpable, a tightly coiled spring waiting to snap. But Skanderbeg held them back. He told them patience is a weapon. Let them grow fat. Let them grow lazy. Let them forget we exist. Skanderbeg spent this time doing the work of a master tactician. He would creep to the edge of the rocky outcrops, peering through the foliage of the sprawling Ottoman camp below. He noted everything with the cold precision of an engineer. He saw where the Janissaries pitched their tents in the center. He saw where the Akinji cavalry corralled their horses on the periphery. He saw the lazy rotations of the guards, noting how they grew fewer and less attentive as the days passed. He noticed that the Ottomans had neglected to secure the high ground around the valley, assuming that no enemy was near enough to take it. He realized that Isak Bey had made a fatal error. He had camped with the Mat River at his back and the mountains to his front, creating a natural kill box. If attacked from the north, the Ottomans would have nowhere to run except into the river. But Skanderbeg needed more than just a tactical advantage. He needed a psychological one. He needed the Ottomans to be completely, utterly unprepared. He waited. He watched the calendar. He waited until the peak of the summer heat, a time when armies traditionally rested during the hottest part of the day to avoid heat stroke. He chose the date carefully. September 2nd. It was the feast day of Saint Mamaz. Skanderbeg knew that Hamza would likely assume the Christians would be observing the holiday in prayer, not preparing for battle. It was the perfect cover for his final movements. On the night before the attack, Skanderbeg gathered his commanders in a hidden ravine. The air was thick with tension. He didn't give a rousing speech about glory or honor. He gave specific, cold instructions. He divided his army into 3 distinct battle groups. The first group, led by his most trusted captains, would circle around the mountain in the darkness to the flanks of the Ottoman camp. The second group would move to block the retreat path to the north, cutting off the escape route. Skanderbeg himself would lead the main charge from the center, straight down the mountain face. The plan relied on a concept called shock and awe, centuries before the term existed. Skanderbeg knew the math: 8,000 men against 40,000. He couldn't win a prolonged battle if the Ottomans had time to organize, to form their lines, to bring their artillery to bear. The Albanians would be crushed. He had to win the battle in the first 10 minutes. He had to hit them so hard, from so many directions at once, that the Ottoman command structure would collapse into panic before they could even draw their swords. As the sun climbed to its zenith on September 2nd, the Ottoman camp was quiet. The heat was oppressive. Soldiers were napping in the shade of the trees. The horses were unsaddled and grazing lazily near the river. Ishak Bey and Hamza were resting in their pavilions, perhaps planning their victory parade in the capital. The valley was peaceful, filled only with the sound of the water and the buzzing of cicadas. They had no idea that the forest above them was alive. They had no idea that the mountain was holding its breath, ready to fall on their heads. It was shortly after midday. The sun was a white-hot disk directly overhead, bleaching the color out of the landscape. In the Ottoman camp, the activity had ground to a halt. The heat in the valley was stifling, trapped by the surrounding hills, turning the air into a heavy, humid blanket. Thousands of soldiers had retreated into their tents to escape the glare. Others lay in the shade of wagons or under the bellies of their horses, dozing in the stupor that comes after a heavy meal and days of inactivity. Even the sentries posted at the perimeter were fighting heavy eyelids. They leaned on their spears, wiping sweat from their foreheads, staring blankly at the heat haze shimmering off the ground. There was no reason to be vigilant. The war was over. The enemy was gone. The world was quiet. And then the mountain screamed. It didn't start with a visual. It started with a sound. From the tree line of Mount Tumenishta, a single trumpet blast shattered the silence, long, clear, and terrifyingly close. Before the echo could even fade, it was joined by another, and then another, until the air was tearing apart with the sound of hundreds of war horns braying in unison. And then came the drums, heavy, rhythmic, pounding like a giant heartbeat that shook the ground. And finally, the voices. 8,000 men roared at once. They screamed the ancient war cries of the Highlanders, a guttural, terrifying noise designed to freeze the blood of anyone who heard it. Down in the valley, the effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Ottoman soldiers woke from their naps into a living nightmare. They scrambled in the darkness of their tents, tripping over weapons, fumbling for helmets that weren't there, trying to understand if they were dreaming or dying. The horses, terrified by the sudden cacophony, tore their tethers and stampeded through the camp, trampling tents and men alike, adding their screams to the chaos. From the tree line, the Albanian army erupted like a landslide. This was not a disorderly mob running down a hill. This was a kinetic weapon released by gravity. The heavy cavalry led the way, a wedge of iron and muscle thundering down the slope. They hit the perimeter of the Ottoman camp with the force of a meteor. There was no resistance. The wooden barricades were smashed to splinters. The first line of Ottoman tents simply ceased to exist, flattened under the hooves of the destriers. Skanderbeg rode at the tip of the spear. Witnesses later said he looked less like a man and more like an avenging angel. With his sword drawn, he cut a path straight toward the center of the camp. toward the banners of the commanders. He knew exactly where Isak Bey and Hamza were. He had been watching them for days. His goal was to decapitate the army before it could even stand up. The tactical genius of the attack lay in the confusion. Skanderbeg had ordered his men to create as much noise as possible. They banged their swords against their shields. They shouted. They blew horns incessantly. In the dust and the panic, the Ottomans had no idea how many men were attacking them. The acoustics of the valley magnified the sound, making 8,000 men sound like 80,000. Isak Bey, stumbling out of his tent, looked up at the mountain and didn't see a small raiding party. He saw the entire world collapsing on him. He assumed that Skanderbeg must have allied with Venice or Naples, that a massive Christian coalition had arrived to annihilate them. The fear of the unknown paralyzed the chain of command. Hamza Castriotti, the man who knew everything, knew nothing. He burst from his pavilion, sword in hand, shouting orders that nobody could hear. He tried to rally his personal guard, but the men were swept away by the tide of panic. He looked at the charging Albanians and saw the banner of the double-headed eagle, Skanderbeg's banner. The realization hit him harder than any physical blow. He is here. He was never gone. I have led us into a grave. The psychological weight of that moment cannot be overstated. Hamza's betrayal was built on the premise that his uncle was finished. Seeing Skanderbeg alive, healthy, and charging with the fury of a demon shattered Hamza's reality. The traitor realized he had been the pawn all along. The elite Janissaries, the pride of the Sultan, tried to form a defensive line. These were men who had never known defeat. Men who were trained to stand firm in the face of hell. They managed to cluster together, locking their shields, trying to create an island of order in the ocean of chaos. But they were unarmored, fighting in their tunics, and they were being attacked from all sides. Skanderbeg's second and third battle groups had completed their encirclement. They poured out of the woods on the flanks, hitting the Ottoman camp from the east and the west. The Ottoman army was now being compressed into a kill zone. The soldiers on the perimeter tried to run toward the center for safety, while the soldiers in the center tried to push out to fight. They collided with each other, creating a crush of bodies where no one could swing a sword or level a pike. The artillery, the great cannons that were supposed to blast Skanderbeg's fortresses apart, sat silent and useless. Their crews dead or fled, the guns pointing at nothing. The violence was intimate and brutal. It wasn't a battle of maneuvers anymore. It was a brawl. The Albanians, fueled by months of hiding and the burning desire to reclaim their land, fought with a savage intensity. They weren't just fighting an invader. They were fighting to punish a betrayal. They carved through the confused mass of Ottoman troops, driving them relentlessly toward the river. Skanderbeg, amidst the carnage, remained coldly focused. He wasn't just killing, he was directing. He signaled his cavalry to wheel and strike, acting like sheepdogs herding a flock. He didn't want a battle. He wanted a rout. He wanted the enemy to lose all cohesion. He saw a group of Sipahis, Ottoman cavalry, trying to mount their horses and organize a countercharge. He immediately directed his own heavy guard to smash into them before they could get into the saddle. The counterattack died before it was born. As the afternoon wore on, the sun began to dip, casting long, bloody shadows across the valley. The noise had changed. It was no longer the roar of battle cries. It was the sound of a massacre. The Ottoman army, the greatest fighting force of the age, had ceased to function as an army. It was now just a terrified mob of individuals, each man trying to save his own life, running blindly away from the demons coming down the mountain. But there was nowhere to run. To the front, the river. To the sides, the ambush. To the rear, the mountain. The trap had snapped shut, and the jaws were made of steel. By late afternoon, the Battle of Albulena had ceased to be a contest of arms and had become a hunt. The cohesion of the Ottoman army had completely disintegrated. The vast, organized camp that had stood that morning, a symbol of imperial order and power, was now a smoking ruin of shredded canvas and broken bodies. The valley floor was slick with mud and blood, churning under the panicked feet of thousands of men trying desperately to escape the slaughter. The Mat River, which had been a source of life and comfort for the army just hours before, now became their grave. As Skanderbeg's forces pressed in from the north, east and west, the only open direction was south, across the water. But the river was not an easy crossing. The banks were steep and muddy, and the water, though not deep, was swift. In their blind terror, thousands of Ottoman soldiers plunged into the current. Men in heavy chainmail sank like stones, dragged down by the weight of their own protection. Horses, maddened by fear, trampled swimmers in their thrashing attempts to find footing. The river choked with the dead and the dying, the water turning a dark, sluggish red as it flowed toward the sea. Ishak Bey Evrenos, the seasoned commander who had survived decades of frontier warfare, realized that the day was lost. He saw that to stay was to die. With a small contingent of his personal guard, he managed to hack a path through the chaos. Abandoning his baggage train, his artillery, and the majority of his men, he fled north toward the mountains, riding with the desperation of a man who feels the breath of death on his neck. He would eventually escape, but he would return to the Sultan, a broken man, bearing the news of the greatest disaster the Ottoman arms had suffered in a generation. But for Hamza Castrioti, there was no escape. History, it seemed, had a specific appointment with him. He had ridden into Albania as a king in waiting, arrogant and assured. Now he was just another fugitive in the mud. He tried to flee, but he was recognized. How could he not be? He wore the finest armor, inlaid with gold, and his face was known to every Albanian soldier. He was the traitor. He was the prize. He was eventually cornered by a group of Skanderbeg's personal guard. They didn't kill him. Death would have been too easy, too quick. They pulled him from his horse, stripped him of his sword and his helmet, and beat him to the ground. They bound his hands with rough rope and dragged him through the dirt like a common criminal. The man who would be king was now a prisoner of the very people he had sold out. When the sun finally set behind the mountains, the scale of the victory became clear. It was staggering. The numbers tell a story of total annihilation. Of the 40,000 Ottoman soldiers who had marched into the valley, it is estimated that between 15 and 30,000 were killed or captured. The field was littered with the debris of an empire, gold standards, jeweled daggers, silk tents, and the entire artillery train of the invasion force. The Albanians had captured enough wealth in a single afternoon to fund their resistance for another decade. But the most poignant moment of the day came after the fighting stopped. Skanderbeg, still in his armor, spattered with the blood of the battle, ordered Hamza to be brought before him. The meeting took place in the ruined center of the Ottoman camp. The uncle and the nephew faced each other. Skanderbeg, the legend who had refused to break. Hamza, the prodigy who had broken his oath. We don't know the exact words that were spoken. The chronicles are silent on the dialogue, perhaps because the silence between them was heavier than any speech. Skanderbeg looked at the young man he had raised, the boy he had taught to ride and fight. He saw the wasted potential. He saw the tragedy of ambition without honor. Hamza, for his part, could not meet his uncle's eyes. He stood with his head bowed, awaiting his execution. In the medieval world, the penalty for treason was death, usually a slow, painful one. Every soldier in the army expected Hamza's head to end up on a pike, but Skanderbeg did something that surprised everyone. He did not execute Hamza. Perhaps it was because they shared the same blood. Perhaps he wanted Hamza to live with the shame of his failure, which was a punishment far worse than death. Instead of the axe, Skanderbeg ordered Hamza to be imprisoned. He would later be sent to Naples, to the dungeons of Skanderbeg's ally, King Ferrante, where he would spend the rest of his life in a dark cell, rotting away while the legend of his uncle only grew brighter. It was a fate of total irrelevance. The one thing Hamza had feared most. The victory at Albulena sent a shockwave through Europe. When the news reached Rome, Pope Calixtus III ordered all the church bells in the city to ring. He named Skanderbeg Captain General of the Holy See. In Venice, the Senate breathed a sigh of relief. The buffer state was still intact. In the courts of Burgundy and France, monarchs who had never been to Albania toasted the name of Skanderbeg. For a moment, the bickering powers of Christendom were united in awe of this mountain chieftain who had done the impossible. But in Constantinople, the mood was one of cold fury. Sultan Mehmed II, the man who had conquered the unconquerable city of Byzantium, had been humbled by a petty rebel. He realized that Skanderbeg could not be defeated by brute force alone. The Battle of Albulena forced the Ottoman Empire to change its entire strategy in the Balkans. They stopped trying to crush Albania with a single blow and settled in for a long, grinding war of attrition. They realized that as long as Skanderbeg lived, Albania would not fall. They would have to wait for time to do what their armies could not. Albulena wasn't just a battle. It was the zenith of Skanderbeg's career. It was the moment where his mastery of asymmetrical warfare was fully realized. It proved that a small, disciplined force fighting on its own terrain and led by a genius could destroy a superpower. It gave the Albanian people a sense of identity and destiny that would sustain them through centuries of occupation that were yet to come. It was the day the Ghost Army became immortal. The sun set on the field of Albulena in 1457, but the long shadow of that day stretched far into the future. For George Castrioti Skanderbeg, the victory was the apex of his life's work, but it was not the end of his war. He would fight on for another 10 grueling years. He would ride into battle again and again, his hair turning white, his body scarred, but his spirit unbroken. He remained the Lion of Albania, the immovable object in the path of the Ottoman unstoppable force. Yet, Albulena remained his masterpiece. It is studied today in military academies, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a perfect case study of the Hukwaso indirect approach to warfare. It stands alongside Hannibal's victory at Cannae or Napoleon's triumph at Austerlitz. It wasn't won by the general with the biggest guns or the most soldiers. It was won by the general with the deepest mind. It demonstrated a truth that is often forgotten in the age of technology, that deception, psychology, and patience are weapons far more lethal than artillery. Skanderbeg didn't just ambush an army at Albulena. He ambushed the arrogance of an empire. He used his enemy's own confidence as the trap that destroyed them. When Skanderbeg finally died in January 1468, he did not die on the battlefield. He died in his bed in the city of Lezhë, surrounded by his captains and his family. He died undefeated. The empire that had swallowed the Balkans, that had shattered the walls of Constantinople, had spent 25 years trying to crush this one man, and they had failed. It is said that when the news of his death reached Constantinople, Sultan Mehmed II did not celebrate. Instead, he is reported to have exclaimed with a mixture of relief and respect, "Asia and Europe are mine at last. Woe to Christendom. She has lost her sword and her shield." Even his greatest enemy acknowledged that Skanderbeg was the titan holding back the Taina. But the legacy of Albulena goes beyond tactics and sultans. It bought time. And in history, time is everything. Skanderbeg's resistance held the gates of Europe shut for a critical quarter century, while he kept the Ottoman armies tied down in the jagged mountains of Albania. Italy was given the breathing room it needed to birth the Renaissance. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo were growing up in a world protected in part by the shield of Skanderbeg. Had Albania fallen in 1457, Had the Ottomans poured into Italy then, the history of Western civilization might look very different today. The cultural flowering of Europe was watered, in a sense, by the blood spilled at Albulena. Today, if you travel to the Mat River Valley in Albania, the battlefield is quiet. The roar of the cannons and the screams of the dying have been replaced by the sound of wind in the grass and the distant bells of sheep. The forests of Mount Tumanishta still stand watch over the plain, silent sentinels of the massacre, but the memory of that day is woven into the DNA of the land. It lives in the folk songs sung in the mountain villages. It lives in the statues in the town squares. It lives in the fierce pride of the Albanian people. The story of Albulena is not just a chapter of Albanian history, it is a universal human story. It is the ultimate underdog narrative. It strikes a chord because we all want to believe that the giant can be slain. We all want to believe that quality matters more than quantity, that spirit can overcome steel, and that a few people with enough courage can stand up to the crushing weight of the inevitable and say, no. Hamza Castrioti is remembered too, but as a warning. He is the tragic figure in the drama, the man who thought he could outsmart destiny. His story reminds us that talent without loyalty is dangerous, and that ambition without a moral compass leads only to ruin. He sought a kingdom and found only a prison cell. He sought to be a king and became a footnote. As we look back at the events of September 1457, we are reminded that history is not just a list of dates and treaties. It is the story of human choices. The choice to fight when surrender makes sense. The choice to betray those who trust you. The choice to endure when all hope is lost. Skanderbeg made his choice in that forest on Mount Tumanishta, and because of it, his name echoes through the centuries. He taught the world a lesson that is as true today as it was then. Never underestimate a ghost. The Battle of Albulena was a miracle, but it was also a warning. It showed the world that the Ottoman Empire, for all its power, was not invincible. It could be bled, it could be tricked, it could be beaten. Skanderbeg's resistance bought Europe 25 precious years. He held the gates shut while the Renaissance began to bloom in Italy. Without him, the history of the Western world might look very different today. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's greatest ambushes, make sure to like and subscribe. We have many more stories of forgotten battles and legendary commanders coming soon. And let me know in the comments, was Hamza Castrioti a villain? Or was he just a man trying to survive in a war he thought was lost? Until next time.